Steel wheels ground against iron rails as the locomotive pulled its cargo through America's countryside in summer 1943. Behind dirty windows, German prisoners of war stared in disbelief at scenes that contradicted everything they believed about their enemy. What unfolded before their eyes would destroy every lie they had been fed about American weakness. These passenger cars offered comfort beyond their expectations. No cramped cattle wagons awaited them. No devastated wasteland stretched before their gaze. Instead, endless fertile fields rolled toward distant horizons. Massive crimson barns dotted the landscape. Modern farm equipment sparkled under golden sunlight. Industrial smokestacks pierced the sky like monuments to manufacturing might. Black smoke billowed upward, not from destruction, but from unstoppable production. A captured soldier named Klaus Weber, taken prisoner in North African sands months before, would soon pen words to his family that captured their collective shock. Everything our leaders told us about America was false. This revelation begins the extraordinary account of how German prisoners discovered America's true industrial power. A power so overwhelming it would fundamentally alter their perception of the war itself. Their homeland's chances of victory would crumble before this new reality. Understanding the magnitude of their shock requires examining the propaganda that had shaped their minds since 1933. Nazi Germany had portrayed America as a declining nation, a mixed-race democracy weakened by diversity, corrupted by Jewish influence, crippled by economic depression. German publications showed American cities as criminal wastelands. American workers appeared lazy and incompetent. American industry seemed primitive compared to the Reich's supposed technological dominance. German military commanders, intoxicated by swift victories in Poland and France, had dismissed American industrial potential with contempt. They highlighted America's delayed entry into the previous World War. They mocked American isolationist tendencies. They ridiculed what appeared to be a soft, consumer-oriented economy. When America joined the conflict in December 1941, German officers confidently predicted that American production would collapse under total warfare's demands. By 1943, as the first massive waves of German captives reached American shores, the United States had already launched history's greatest industrial mobilization. American factories supplied nearly two-thirds of all Allied military equipment throughout the entire war. They produced 297,000 aircraft. They manufactured 193,000 artillery pieces. They built 86,000 tanks. They assembled 2 million military trucks. In 4 short years, American industrial output, already the planet's largest, expanded to double its original size. The German prisoners boarding those westbound trains remained ignorant of these staggering statistics. They were about to receive an education that would haunt their remaining days. At the program's peak in May 1945, American camps held 425,821 prisoners of war. This number included 371,383 Germans, 50,173 Italians, and 3,151 Japanese soldiers. These men arrived not gradually but in enormous waves. Some had been captured in North African deserts. Others fell prisoner in Normandy's fields. Still more surrendered in the Ardennes forests. Each group brought fresh eyes that would witness America's industrial miracle directly. Their typical journey started at Atlantic ports like New York or Norfolk. There, German prisoners underwent processing and received assignments to camps scattered across the continental United States. Rather than windowless freight cars they might have anticipated, American authorities transported captives in standard passenger trains. Often these were identical cars that carried American civilians nationwide. Geneva Convention requirements demanded humane prisoner treatment. America took these obligations seriously. But strategic considerations also influence this approach. American officials recognized that well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate. They might provide valuable intelligence. They could potentially embrace democratic principles. Nobody anticipated they were creating the most powerful propaganda tool imaginable. The simple truth about American abundance would speak louder than any planned message. As trains rolled westward, German prisoners found themselves on an unplanned tour of American industrial supremacy. They passed through Pennsylvania's steel regions, where blast furnaces illuminated night skies like artificial suns. They glimpsed Detroit's sprawling automotive plants. Assembly lines that once produced Chevrolets and Fords now manufactured Sherman tanks and aircraft engines with mechanical precision. The massive industrial centers impressed them, but abundance appeared everywhere. Well-maintained highways stretched endlessly toward horizons. Countless automobiles filled every small town's streets. Electric lights illuminated even remote farmhouses. Telegraph and telephone lines connected the continent's most isolated corners. Hans Miller, a Russian front veteran captured during the Battle of the Bulge, later described his first glimpse of an American city from his train window. "We traveled through Chicago during the night hours. Even in darkness, you could observe furnace flames stretching for endless kilometers. The city extended so far, blazed so brightly, it resembled a manufactured constellation. In Germany, even Berlin appeared dim by comparison. We endured blackouts, rationing, shortages everywhere. Here they seemed to have forgotten a war was happening." Miller's observation carried more significance than he realized. While German civilians survived on carefully measured bread portions, meat rations, and coal allowances, American cities glowed with light and activity. Even under wartime restrictions, American rationing remained generous compared to ordinary German hardships. A typical American family's weekly meat allocation could have fed a German household for an entire month. The prisoners began whispering among themselves. Where were the bomb craters their propaganda promised Allied raids had carved across American cities? Where was the social collapse their leaders had predicted? Instead, they observed bustling railway stations. Well-dressed civilians walked purposefully about their business. Infrastructure appeared not merely intact, but thriving under total war mobilization's pressure. Worker assignments became central features as labor shortages affected the United States throughout the conflict. German prisoners worked in agriculture, forestry, construction, and various industries. Often they replaced American workers who had joined military service. This work program became the vehicle through which German captives gained intimate knowledge of American productive capacity. The prisoner camps themselves defied every expectation. Built to Geneva Convention standards and frequently exceeding them, these installations featured modern barracks with electric lighting systems. Indoor plumbing provided comfort. Recreational facilities offered entertainment. Medical care often surpassed what German prisoners admitted their own military hospitals provided German soldiers. Camp Concordia in Kansas represented one of hundreds of such installations across America. German prisoners found themselves in facilities resembling American college campuses more than prison compounds. Barracks remained clean and properly ventilated. Mess halls served regular, substantial meals. Libraries contained German books and newspapers. Work assignments truly opened their eyes to American reality. There were occasions when prisoners told fellow prisoners to reduce their work efforts, according to historian Lowell May, author of Camp Concordia, German POWs in the Midwest. Punishment for such work slowdowns usually consisted of several days' confinement, with bread and water rations only. The irony struck everyone forcefully. German prisoners required instructions to work less, not more. The abundance they witnessed made many eager to participate in American agricultural and industrial production. This created the curious situation where enemy prisoners voluntarily contributed to the very war machine defeating their homeland. Many German prisoners received assignments to agricultural work across America's vast farming regions. For men from an increasingly hungry and desperate nation, working in American fields provided revelations bordering on the surreal. Friedrich Kemper, assigned to Nebraska wheat farming, later wrote about machines unlike anything existing in Germany even before the war. Combines could harvest 50 hectares in single days. Tractors were so numerous they remained sitting in fields overnight without guards. In Germany, such equipment would have been worth fortunes and protected like crown jewels. But machinery alone didn't astonish German prisoners. The casual abundance surrounding American agriculture amazed them equally. Farms stretched beyond horizons, operated by individual families with hired help. Granaries so enormous they could feed entire German cities. Cattle herds so vast that prisoners initially thought they were observing multiple farms, only to learn these thousands of animals belonged to individual ranches. German prisoners began understanding something their high command had fundamentally misunderstood. America wasn't merely an industrial power. It was the world's greatest agricultural powerhouse, capable of feeding not only its own population, but much of the Allied world. While German civilians learned making bread from sawdust and potatoes, American farmers worried about overproduction. This realization hit German prisoners with physical force. They began comprehending that their nation hadn't simply declared war on America's military. They had declared war on the world's breadbasket. Agriculture was only the beginning. As German prisoners received industrial work detail assignments, they encountered the true scope of American manufacturing might. In Pennsylvania, steel mills, German metallurgists and engineers found themselves working alongside production lines that dwarfed anything they had seen in the Ruhr Valley. At a single plant outside Pittsburgh, German prisoners watched American workers produce more steel in one shift than many German foundries managed in entire weeks. The scale overwhelmed them so completely that some prisoners initially refused believing what they observed. They insisted they must be visiting multiple facilities disguised as one enormous complex. The technology also provided revelation. While German industry had been forced to rely increasingly on slave labor and makeshift materials as war progressed, American factories hummed with the latest automated machinery. Well-trained, well-fed workers operated equipment with efficiency that seemed to take this industrial miracle for granted. Ernst Weber, a German engineer assigned to work in a California aircraft plant, wrote letters home that military censors intercepted. His words painted pictures of disbelief. Today, I watched them complete 17 four-engine bombers. Not in a week, not in a month, in a single day. The assembly line stretches nearly 2 kilometers. They have materials here that we cannot obtain in Germany. Aluminum, rubber, high-grade steel. They use them not sparingly, but lavishly. Weber's observation proved particularly poignant because it highlighted Nazi Germany's greatest strategic miscalculation. German planners had assumed America, like European nations, would be constrained by limited resources and industrial capacity. They failed grasping that America possessed not just the world's largest industrial base, but also many of the world's richest natural resources. Oil fields covered Texas. Iron ore filled Minnesota mines. Coal deposits spread throughout Appalachia. Forests seemed to stretch forever. What disturbed German prisoners most wasn't just American production's scale. It was American workers' attitudes. German soldiers imprisoned at countryside camps had been hired out to ease wartime labor shortages. For months, they spent all waking hours at farms like the Camlin property, building barns and repairing fences. As weeks passed, families grew close to these enemy soldiers. When Christmas arrived, mothers cooked feasts and invited Germans to share them. These personal interactions revealed something German propaganda had completely failed to prepare them for. Americans weren't the demoralized, divided population they expected to encounter. Instead, they found people united in purpose, confident in their cause, remarkably generous even toward enemies. The contrast with home conditions couldn't have been more stark. While German civilians faced increasing hardship, American families invited enemy soldiers to share Christmas dinners. While German workers toiled under increasingly brutal conditions, American laborers maintained productivity levels that seemed almost impossible while still enjoying labor protections, decent wages, and abundant food. German prisoners began realizing America wasn't just outproducing Germany, it was accomplishing this while maintaining living standards that made German prosperity, even in the best times, appear primitive by comparison. As 1943 became 1944, and German prisoners continued flowing into American camps in increasing numbers, disturbing patterns emerged in letters these men wrote home. Letters that German authorities carefully censored before reaching families. Prisoners found themselves in impossible positions. They wanted reassuring families they were receiving good treatment, but they couldn't describe true conditions without implying German propaganda had lied about American weakness. They wanted maintaining home front morale. But they couldn't unsee what they had witnessed of American industrial capacity. Between carefully worded lines, new understanding began emerging. References to adequate food and reasonable working conditions were prisoners' careful ways of describing abundance their families could scarcely imagine. Mentions of large farms and efficient factories were understated descriptions of agricultural and industrial capacity that dwarfed anything in Germany. Some prisoners stopped writing altogether, overwhelmed by cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught to believe and what they experienced daily. Others wrote letters so subdued and careful that families began worrying American propaganda was brainwashing their loved ones. In reality, prisoners were experiencing something far more powerful than propaganda. They were encountering truth so overwhelming it shattered their entire worldview. By early 1944, as strategic bombing campaigns intensified over Germany and news filtered back to prisoner camps about German city destruction, terrible realization began dawning on German prisoners. They weren't just witnessing American abundance. They were witnessing the source of bombs falling on their homeland. Every aircraft engine they observed rolling off American assembly lines represented dozens of bombers that would soon fly over German cities. Every tank they watched emerge from Detroit factories was destined for European battlefields, where it would face whatever remained of German armor. Every ship they glimpsed in American harbors carried supplies that would sustain Allied armies as they closed in on the Reich from all directions. German prisoners began understanding their nation hadn't just picked a fight with America. They had declared war on the arsenal of democracy, an industrial colossus so vast and powerful that Germany never possessed realistic chances of victory. But perhaps the most disturbing realization was yet coming. As these men worked in American fields and factories, as they witnessed casual abundance of American life, as they observed confidence and determination of American people, they began suspecting something that would have been treasonous to voice aloud. America wasn't just going to win the war. It was going to reshape the entire world in its image. The full implications of this realization would become clear in months and years that followed. German prisoners of war found themselves not just witnesses to American power, but reluctant participants in the very industrial machine sealing their homeland's fate. As we prepare exploring deeper implications of this awakening, one question haunts the narrative. What happens when an entire generation of soldiers discovers everything they've been taught about their enemy, and themselves has been carefully constructed lies? The answer would reshape not just individual prisoners, but the very nature of post-war Germany itself. Summer 1944 brought news that struck German prisoner camps like thunderbolts. D-Day had succeeded. Allied forces poured into Western Europe with floods of men and material that seemed endless. As German prisoners worked in American factories, they found themselves manufacturing the very weapons and supplies enabling this unstoppable advance. The psychological impact proved devastating. These men weren't just witnessing American industrial might. They were participating in it. Every tank component they helped assemble, every aircraft part they manufactured, every ton of grain they helped harvest contributed to their homeland's inevitable defeat. What came next would prove even more transformative. A systematic effort to show these German soldiers not just what America could produce, but what America truly represented. By late 1944, American military intelligence recognized an unprecedented opportunity. These hundreds of thousands of German prisoners weren't just mouths to feed and bodies to guard. They were potential ambassadors who would someday return to Germany with first-hand knowledge of American society, democracy, and prosperity. The re-education program that emerged was unlike anything attempted in military history. At special facilities throughout Britain and its empire, large numbers of Germans were subjected to carefully designed political re-education programs. But the American approach proved subtly different. Less formal indoctrination, more experiential learning. American officers began organizing tours of American cities for selected German prisoners. These weren't propaganda exercises, but genuine invitations to witness American life without filters or restrictions. German captives found themselves walking through department stores filled with consumer goods that had vanished from German shelves years earlier. They visited American schools, churches, and community centers, observing society that functioned with vitality and optimism, starkly contrasting the increasingly desperate atmosphere they had left behind in Germany. Wilhelm Steber, captured at Normandy, described one such visit to a typical American high school in Iowa. The building was larger and better equipped than many German universities. Students, boys and girls learning together, had access to laboratories, libraries, and workshops that would have been the envy of German technical colleges. And this was just one school, in one small town, among thousands across America. But casual abundance truly shattered German preconceptions. American teenagers drove automobiles to school. Automobiles that would have been luxury items reserved for Nazi Party officials in Germany. American families owned multiple radios, electric refrigerators, and washing machines. Even working-class American homes had amenities that middle-class German families could only dream of. As war progressed and German prisoners gained greater access to American industrial facilities, the true scope of American production capacity became undeniably clear. These men weren't just seeing individual factories. They were witnessing an interconnected industrial ecosystem of staggering complexity and scale. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, German prisoners watched in amazement as Ford's assembly line produced B-24 Liberator bombers at rates of one aircraft every 63 minutes. The facility itself was so enormous, it enclosed more floor space than any building German prisoners had ever imagined possible. 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. But even more impressive than scale was systematic efficiency. German engineers, many of whom had worked in supposedly superior German aircraft industry, found themselves studying American production techniques with students' intensity. The precision tooling, interchangeable parts, careful coordination of thousands of workers. It was industrial organization elevated to art form. Heinrich Weber, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over England and eventually transferred to an American camp, worked several months at a Boeing plant in Seattle. His journals, discovered years later by his family, captured his growing amazement. Today, they completed 42 four-engine bombers. I flew against these aircraft over Germany, never imagining America was producing them faster than we could shoot them down. They are building them like automobiles with the same casual efficiency. Weber's observation highlighted crucial German miscalculation. The Luftwaffe had calculated American aircraft production based on traditional European models, assuming complex military aircraft required months of individual craftsmanship. They had no concept of American mass production techniques that could turn out sophisticated bombers with the same systematic approach used to manufacture civilian cars. What disturbed many German prisoners most wasn't American production's scale, but human relationships they observed in American workplaces. German industry, even before the war, had been characterized by rigid hierarchy, harsh discipline, and clear separation of management from labor. American factories, by contrast, seemed almost casual in their human interactions. German prisoners watched American foremen consulting with assembly line workers about production problems. They saw labor unions negotiating with management, something that would have been unthinkable under the Nazi system. They observed safety protocols that protected workers, productivity bonuses that rewarded efficiency, and cafeterias serving meals that German workers could only have imagined. Most shocking was the treatment of German prisoners themselves. These captives were paid 80 cents per day for their labor. This sum, while modest by American standards, represented fair compensation by standards they knew from Germany. They received medical care when injured, time off when sick, and treatment acknowledging their basic human dignity, even as enemy soldiers. Franz Müller, a German mechanic from the Ruhr Valley who worked in an American steel mill, later wrote about American workers treating them not as enemies, but as fellow workers. When I was injured in an accident, they rushed to help me just as they would help one of their own. The company doctor who treated my broken arm was the same doctor who treated American workers. I began understanding America wasn't just fighting a war. They were fighting for a way of life that included everyone, even their enemies. As 1944 turned to 1945 and news from Germany became increasingly grim, German prisoners found themselves confronting uncomfortable truth. They were living better as prisoners in America than they had as free citizens in Nazi Germany. Daily caloric intake for German captives in American camps exceeded what German civilians had received even before the war. Medical care available to prisoners was superior to what German soldiers had received in their own military hospitals. Recreational facilities, educational opportunities, and basic amenities available in American prisoner camps surpassed what most German workers had enjoyed in the Reich's supposed Golden Age. This realization created profound psychological crisis for many prisoners. Everything they had been taught about German superiority, American decadence, and their cause's righteousness began crumbling under daily evidence's weight. Some prisoners responded with denial, insisting what they experienced must be elaborate deception designed to weaken their morale. Others retreated into depression, overwhelmed by cognitive dissonance between their lived experience and lifelong beliefs. But growing numbers began quietly acknowledging what they could no longer deny. Germany had declared war on a nation that was not only more powerful, but in many ways more humane than their own. Perhaps the most powerful education came not in factories or military installations, but in ordinary American family homes. They had benefited from being held by a nation that largely did not hate German soldiers. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans solely blamed the German government, not Germans, for the war. This attitude translated into extraordinary acts of hospitality and human connection. German prisoners found themselves invited to American homes for holiday dinners. They were included in community celebrations and treated as individuals rather than enemies. American families shared their rationed luxuries with German soldiers. American children played with prisoners during work details. American churches welcomed German captives to services conducted in their native language. Karl Heinz Weber, a young Panzer crew member captured in France, spent Christmas 1944 with an American farming family in Nebraska. Decades later, he would describe it as the moment his worldview permanently shifted. They had a son serving in the Pacific, fighting against Japan. They had another son somewhere in Europe, possibly fighting against my former comrades. Yet they welcomed me into their home, fed me at their table, and treated me like family. I realized Americans weren't fighting because they hated Germans. They were fighting because they believed in something larger than themselves. This experience was replicated thousands of times across America. German prisoners found themselves participating in American community life in ways that would have been impossible to imagine under Nazi Germany's rigid social structure. They attended baseball games, participated in harvest festivals, and observed a democratic society functioning with vitality and inclusiveness that contrasted starkly with the authoritarian system they had left behind. As 1945 progressed and victory in Europe became inevitable, German prisoners found themselves witnesses to industrial mobilization that was winding down rather than ramping up. American factories that had been producing weapons of war were already beginning to retool for peacetime production. The same assembly lines that had manufactured tanks were preparing to produce automobiles, refrigerators, and consumer goods. This transition revealed another dimension of American industrial superiority that German observers had missed: flexibility. German industry, organized around centralized planning and rigid efficiency, struggled to adapt to changing circumstances. American industry, driven by market forces and decentralized decision-making, could shift gears with remarkable speed and agility. German prisoners watched American factories preparing for a post-war boom that would dwarf even wartime production levels. They saw plans for suburban developments that would house millions of returning veterans. Interstate highway systems would connect every corner of the continent. Consumer goods would make pre-war luxuries available to ordinary families. The implications were staggering. America hadn't just outproduced Germany during the war. It had done so while simultaneously preparing for peacetime prosperity that would make its wartime achievements look modest by comparison. But perhaps the most profound education came through exposure to American democracy in action. German prisoners observed local elections, witnessed public debates about government policy, and saw citizens freely criticizing their leaders without fear of reprisal. They read American newspapers that published diverse opinions. They listened to radio programs featuring open discussion of controversial topics. They participated in discussions with American civilians who expressed their views without looking over their shoulders. For men raised under an authoritarian system where political dissent was treason and independent thought was dangerous, American democracy was revelation. German prisoners watched American communities debate and resolve local issues through democratic processes. They saw how American federalism allowed different states and regions to maintain their distinct characteristics while participating in unified national effort. Most remarkably, they witnessed how American democracy had mobilized for total war without sacrificing its fundamental character. Despite wartime restrictions and sacrifices, Americans had maintained their civil liberties, their free press, and their democratic institutions. Elections had continued on schedule. Political opposition had remained legal. Public debate had continued even about the conduct of the war itself. By spring 1945, as news of Germany's final collapse reached American prisoner camps, German prisoners found themselves looking into a mirror that reflected uncomfortable truths about their homeland and themselves. They had witnessed not just American strength, but American values in action. They had experienced not just American prosperity, but American generosity toward enemies. The contrast with Nazi Germany couldn't have been more stark. While their homeland had pursued conquest through brutality and oppression, America had achieved victory while maintaining its humanitarian principles. While Nazi ideology had promised a 1,000-year Reich built on racial superiority and authoritarian control, American democracy had demonstrated the power of inclusive institutions and individual freedom. Many German prisoners began understanding their defeat hadn't been merely military. It had been civilizational. They hadn't just lost a war. They had discovered their entire worldview had been built on lies and delusions. When the war ended in May 1945, prisoners were required to watch films of what occurred at Nazi concentration camps, and then they were brought back to Germany. This final shock, learning the full extent of Nazi atrocities, completed the psychological transformation that American abundance had begun. The repatriation process, which continued through 1946 and into 1947, presented American authorities with unique opportunity and challenge. After repatriation, about 5,000 Germans emigrated to the United States, and thousands of others returned later to visit. But most would return to a Germany that lay in ruins, facing the enormous task of reconstruction and moral reckoning. These former prisoners carried with them not just memories of American abundance, but deep understanding of what democracy looked like in practice. They had witnessed society that combined prosperity with freedom, strength with compassion, and victory with magnanimity. They would become, in many cases, ambassadors for democratic values in a Germany that desperately needed to rebuild its political and moral foundations. The impact of these former captives on post-war Germany cannot be overstated. They returned to a homeland that was not just physically destroyed, but morally and psychologically shattered. Nazi ideology that had defined German life for 12 years had been exposed as a catastrophic lie. The German people faced enormous challenges of rebuilding not just their cities and economy, but their entire understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Former prisoners who had experienced American democracy firsthand became crucial voices in this reconstruction. They had seen how democratic institutions could function effectively. They had witnessed how free markets could generate prosperity. They had observed how diverse populations could work together toward common goals. They brought back practical knowledge of American industrial techniques, agricultural methods, and organizational principles that would prove invaluable in rebuilding German society. But more importantly, they brought back visions of what Germany could become. Having witnessed American prosperity and freedom, they could imagine a German future that wasn't built on conquest and domination, but on productivity and cooperation. Having experienced American democracy, they could envision German institutions based on consent rather than coercion. As we look back on this remarkable chapter in history, we can see how German captives' experience in America contributed to one of the most successful transformations in human history. The Germany that emerged from 1945's rubble became a stable democracy, a prosperous economy, and a responsible member of the international community. The men who had laughed at American industrial might, in 1941, return to Germany with profound understanding of what they had underestimated. They had witnessed not just America's ability to produce weapons and consumer goods, but its capacity to create society that combined material abundance with human dignity. Their story reminds us that the greatest victories aren't always won on battlefields. Sometimes they're won in quiet moments, when former enemies discover their common humanity. Sometimes they're won in factory workshops, where prisoners and guards work side by side. Sometimes they're won around American dinner tables, where German soldiers learn their hosts' children are fighting overseas, yet still extend hospitality to former enemies. The German prisoners who crossed America by train in 1943 as defeated enemies left as reluctant witnesses to truth that would reshape their homeland. Democracy and prosperity weren't just possible but powerful, beyond anything their authoritarian system had achieved. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its industrial capacity, impressive as that was. It was the simple revolutionary idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, create prosperity through freedom, and treat even their enemies with dignity and respect. The laughter had indeed stopped, but in its place came something far more powerful: understanding, respect, and hope for a better world built on the foundation of democratic values and human decency. This was America's true victory. Not just the defeat of fascism, but the demonstration that there was a better way to organize human society. German prisoners who witnessed this transformation became its messengers, carrying democracy's seeds back to a homeland ready to plant them in soil, prepared by defeat but enriched by the possibility of redemption. This story serves as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the power of truth, compassion, and democratic values can transform enemies into allies, prisoners into ambassadors, and defeat into the foundation for lasting peace.